time of year again. That festive season.
Fabulous.
That family home and hearth time.
If there's one man responsible for our notion of the modern Christmas, it's quill-wielding polymath Charles Dickens. He romanticised and popularised our notion of Christmas in a series of stories that he released every year, the most loved of which is the one that launched 1,000 Muppets, A Christmas Carol.
Dickens loved acting, and all year round he read out his Christmas Carol to packed theatres. He was the English Santa.
The audiences saw Charles Dickens as the epitome of Yuletide spirit, and they warmed to his descriptions of the Cratchit family huddled around the meagre goose and Christmas pudding.
Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, what a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said. He regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all.
So, we all know the fiction of puddings the size of space hoppers and cheeky cockneys made good by the patronage of their class overlords. But what about the truth behind the fiction? And that is that Dickens spent over 2 decades with his loyal wife, Catherine, who's largely been airbrushed from his history. It's a great irony that this country's greatest author couldn't simply write himself the happy ending he created for his characters. Instead, his marriage collapsed in heartbreak and betrayal. Welcome to Mrs. Dickens's Family Christmas. Cheers. Oh, I love a cold tea. And I think that one's a 72.
Middle-class London in the early 1830s. The tail end of the Georgian era, soon to see the dawn of Victorian England. Genteel, safe, not a bad place for a respectable young woman on the hunt for a husband. Like the future Mrs. Dickens. Catherine Thompson Hogarth came from a large, sophisticated Scottish family that had settled in the capital.
Wife, mother, homemaker, domestic goddess. Just 4 of the things least likely to be inscribed on my tombstone. But for Catherine, they were vital. Whilst men could disport themselves in the public sphere, women had to shine in the private sphere, where they were responsible for creating a happy and harmonious household full of kids, the ultimate in middle-class respectability.
19-year-old Catherine had been well trained. She could sew, speak French, play the piano, and her family was a good one. A literary editor, her papa had been friends with one of Britain's greatest novelists, Sir Walter Scott.
Now, Catherine wasn't a genius. How could she be? She didn't have the advantage of an education. And she wasn't a stunner either. But she was blue-eyed and bonny, she was well-informed and witty, and her family had excellent literary connections. All in all, for a man looking for a secure and cultured life, she was the perfect catch.
Enter Charles Dickens. Oh, not this one. That was later on. No, in 1835, when Catherine met him, Charles John Hopham Dickens looked like this. No one would have guessed he was the son of an obscure naval clerk with money problems. A campaigning journalist and budding playwright, Dickens was a dandy and man about town.
In his early 20s, Dickens decided he wanted to achieve a look that was as sparkling as his wit. And so he invested in a brand new outfit. And it was an image that would serve him very well.
This is the young Dickens getting dressed up.
So you go for something...
For a night out on the town, or maybe just a day shopping. It's a little big.
Yes, it is a little big.
We can take that in.
Yeah, you can do something
to
with that,
suit your svelte self.
Don't worry, because I can always take this out. It's always a battle.
We want something like this. We want something like this. Oh, yes.
Yeah?
That's very dashing. So this is the uniform that he adopts when he's young, and he sticks with it for the rest of his life. And what's interesting is that when he's younger, he does a lot of amateur theatricals, and this is like a costume. This is the young Dickens who is on the verge of moving from being an amateur actor to a professional writer, and this is what kind of covers that transition.
But he sticks with it, so basically it's like the stonewashed denim of a Top Gear presenter. They will never alter, you know. Fashion cannot change them.
Exactly, because this is the Dickens brand. He was confident, he was borderline cocky, but it was a shell. It's something that he could hide behind, like a kind of suit of armour. Inside Dickens, there is this wounded child whose wounds never really heal, who is the 12-year-old who's sent to work in a blacking factory where he spends maybe a year, maybe more, maybe less, slapping labels onto pots of shoe polish. And he feels he's never going to escape. Finally, he does. But there's always that great fear, that anxiety that he's never going to really make it. And that's what's inside the waistcoat.
Charles was only just middle class. He'd fought his way to respectability. Catherine, his social superior, knew nothing of this. No one did. Mr. Dickens improves very much on acquaintance, she wrote. He is very gentlemanly and pleasant. Judging by his early letters to her, now in the British Library, they were very much in love. He adoringly calls her Dearest Mouse, Darling Tatty, Darling Pig. What is so exciting about reading these letters is that, although we don't get her voice specifically, we get their relationship. There's definite love and affection here. He's not trying to convince an audience of anything at this point. Whatever he writes here is for one person's eyes only. I have never ceased to love you for one moment since I knew you, he writes, nor shall I. There's a page which leaps out at you because, firstly, there's this ridiculous, grotesquely florid signature. And then underneath it, he's written 99 0 0 0 0. There are 33 zeros, kisses. I didn't realise there was a number bigger than the American national debt, but if there is, it's here. It's the sort of handwritten equivalent of, no, you put the phone down. No, you put the phone down. I don't believe he's in his 20s. I don't believe it, but yet he is. To me, it's this 13-year-old boy. If you knew how much delight it would afford me to be able to turn round to you at our own fireside when my work is done, and to seek in your kind looks and gentle manner the recreation and happiness which the moping solitude of chambers can never afford. I'm almost jealous. I mean, most of the time, all I have to show after my relationships, even the long ones, is a couple of emails and a writ. There you go. On the 2nd of April, 1836, Catherine and Charles married in style at Chelsea's Cathedral, the sparkling new mock Gothic marvel of St. Luke's. She told Charles she'd be happy anywhere with him, and they set up home in his bachelor pad at this fashionable block in Holborn, London. With them, a cook, a maid, and Catherine's younger sister. Mary Hogarth was blue-eyed and red-lipped, 16, and very sweet. For Dickens, there was definitely something about Mary.
Well, I think the best deal for him was when he could have a wife and a sister in the same home, as he did with Mary Hogarth.
Which is normal for the time, but the way it's odd with him. I think the way he deals with that is odd psychologically.
Well, I think the way he refers to it too, my pair of petticoats, he calls them. That's his wife and his sister-in-law. I think he would have been happiest as a pharaoh in ancient Egypt. I think they married their sisters regularly.
Christmas 1836 was the Dickens' first as a married couple, and one of their happiest. Charles had the home, wife and sister of his dreams. Catherine was expecting their first child, and another new arrival had burst upon the world: the Pickwick Papers. Completed in 1837, this runaway bestseller contains a blueprint for the cheery family Christmas Dickens had never had as a child. The Pickwick Club's visit to the Wardle family for a splendid seasonal knees-up.
Happy, happy Christmas. This, said Mr. Pickwick, looking around him, this is indeed comfort. Our invariable custom, replied Mr. Wardle. Everybody sits down with us on Christmas Eve, as you can see them now, servants and all, and here we wait until the clock strikes 12 to usher Christmas in and beguile the time with forfeits and old stories. Trundle, my boy, rake up the fire. Up flew the bright sparks in myriads as the logs were stirred. The deep red blaze sent forth a rich glow that penetrated into the farthest corner of the room and cast its cheerful tint on every face.
Family reality and public fiction were perfectly matched. On the 12th night of that first Christmas, Catherine gave birth to their first child, Charlie. The birth in the home, as usual in those days, went smoothly, but not the aftermath.
Catherine wasn't able to breastfeed, and so she just cried every time she saw Charlie. And she was subject to the medical thoughts and views of the time. This is Thomas Bull's Hints to Mothers, which suggests that all new mothers should lie prone between 2 to 4 weeks in case their wombs fell out. Bored now. See, after just a few minutes I'd have got up and probably created a fallopian tube landslide, but in all seriousness, it's very easy to put yourself in the place of Catherine. There's so few roles given to Victorian women. She's failed already at the first hurdle of the primary one, that of being a mum. Imagine her here, lying in the silence, just listening to the sound of her child crying, wanting to help it, but not being able to do anything. Meanwhile, her husband is off gallivanting and shopping with her younger sister. It's so easy to understand how quickly she could have succumbed to the black dog of depression.
In his fiction, Dickens made a joke of it. When little Dombey has no mother to breastfeed him in Dombey and Son of 1848, Mr. Chick asks, "Couldn't something be done with a teapot?" In real life, Charles later claimed that a mental disorder made Catherine a bad wife and mother, a travesty of the truth, according to recent scholarship.
You have to remember that she's locked up in her room for about a month, but only with the first 2 deliveries. So after the first 2 deliveries, when she gets out of confinement earlier, she has no depression at all. Biographers and critics are still talking about how Catherine was weak, and talking about how she was a non-entity, and talking about how she had a nervous disability and all the rest of it. They've just bought it hook, line, and sinker. There's no indication at any point that she had some nervous disturbance, that she was mentally ill, that she was incompetent.
The fact is, they were a happy couple and he loved her. In 1837, they moved to a bigger home, 48 Doughty Street. Fully recovered, Catherine was a loving mother. "My darling boy," she wrote, "grows sweeter and lovelier every day." The couple were avid theatre-goers. In May 1837, accompanied by Mary, they went to see a one-act farce in the West End, which Charles had recently completed on their second honeymoon. Called Is She His Wife? It features the newly married Mr. Lovetown, already bored stiff with his missus.
I repeat, my dear, that I'm very dull in this out-of-the-way villa. Confoundedly dull. Horridly dull.
And I repeat that if you took any pleasure in your wife's society, or felt for her as you once professed to feel, you would have no cause to make such a complaint.
If I did not know you to be one of the sweetest creatures in existence, my dear, I should be strongly disposed to say you were a very close imitation of an aggravating female.
That's very curious, my dear. For I declare that if I hadn't known you to be such an exquisite, good-tempered, attentive husband, I should have mistaken you for a very great brute.
My dear, you're offensive.
My love, you're intolerable.
In The Marriage, as in Dickens's books, comedy and calamity were often bedfellows. That night, back home, Catherine's sister Mary unaccountably collapsed, never to recover.
Catherine was so shocked by Mary's sudden death that she ended up having a miscarriage. We've often said, she wrote, that we had too much happiness to last. And she probably would have written it in this very room, which, you know, up until then had been full of so much promise. With a newborn baby and another on the way, his career taking off and her loyally by his side. And in one night, that is wiped from them, and this place becomes transformed into a place of sadness and bereavement.
Charles's reaction was, well, very odd, rather dramatic and self-centred.
Dickens said, "Thank God she died in my arms, and that the last words she whispered were of me." Which I think remains the most singularly narcissistic statement I have ever heard in my entire life. As if the greater tragedy would have been that she died and Charles wasn't there to hold her, or that she died and that she hadn't managed in her final and dying breaths to mention him.
Mary was laid to rest at the then brand new cemetery at Kensal Green, North London. Young, beautiful and good, God in his mercy numbered her with his angels at the early age of 17, wrote Charles Dickens. He wanted to be buried in the same grave, lying above her for eternity. Unfortunately, Mary's brother was given the slot instead. Now Mary was dead, it seemed in some strange way to give Charles permission to be in love with her. Very odd, even by Victorian standards.
Thank God she died before she could do anything as grubby and fun as actually having sex. But he idealised her. He was obsessed with her. In fact, a family friend remarked, one cannot doubt that his romantic love was given to Mary. And he would call her his ideal to anyone who'd listen, including his own wife. Nice.
Mary was replaced in the home by Georgina, another of Catherine's little sisters. Virgins played a big role in the Dickens' marriage and in Charles's fiction. In 1841, he completed The Old Curiosity Shop, starring Little Nell. This virtuous young maiden looks after her ailing grandpapa, while she's lusted after by one of Dickens' most creepy creations, the oversexed dwarf, Mr. Quilp.
When the child looked up again, she found that he was regarding her with extraordinary favour and complacency. You look very pretty today, Nellie. Charmingly pretty. You tired, Nellie? No, sir, I'm in a hurry to get back, for he'll be anxious while I'm away. Oh, no hurry, little Nell. No hurry at all, said Quilp. How should you like to be my number 2, Nellie? To be what, sir? My number 2, Nellie, my second. My Mrs. Quilp, said the dwarf. The child looked frightened, but seemed not to understand him, which Mr. Quilp, observing, hastened to make his meaning more distinctly. To be Mrs. Quilp the second when Mrs. Quilp the first is dead, sweet Nell, said Quilp, wrinkling up his eyes and luring her towards him with bent forefinger. To be my wife, my little cherry-cheeked, red-lipped wife. Say that Mrs. Quilp lives 5 years or only 4. It was just the proper age for me.
When little Nell dies, her grandfather keeps her clothes. In real life, Dickens kept Mary's, saying, "They will moulder away in their secret places." A troubled, mercurial soul, for now he held his demons at bay, often by transmuting them into great fiction. In the 1830s and 40s, Charles Dickens became the most famous writer on earth. From Oliver Twist to Martin Chuzzlewit, from Nicholas Nickleby to David Copperfield, Catherine's husband produced some of English literature's masterpieces.
He explodes onto the scene. Nobody has seen anything like it. He became a public celebrity. There were commercial spin-offs like sweets and pastries and a certain kind of trousers which you could buy, all of which were adverts for his novels. He's like a modern rock star. Yes, he has that kind of recognition.
The fame of his talents, wrote Catherine, are now known all over the world, but his kind, affectionate heart is dearer to me than all. She, in her own way, was equally productive. Catherine had another child, and then another, and another, and another, and another, so that by 1852 she'd spent half her married life pregnant. That's nearly 3,000 days up the duff. Ow! First up, Charlie, Mary, Katie, Walter, Francis, Alfred, Sidney, Henry, Dora, and at number 10, Edward. Or as their father liked to nickname them, Flaster Floby, Mild Gloucester, Lucifer Box, Young Skull, Chicken Stalker, Skittle, the Ocean Spectre, Mr. H, Dora, Plornish Maroon. To fit them all in 1851 they moved to Tavistock House, a spacious North London mansion. Now, broods of this size weren't entirely unusual because couples didn't really do contraception. The vulcanisation of rubber in 1844 meant that condoms were more widely available, but they were thick and they had heavy seams and they were reusable. Think of them as intimate wellies. Gentlemen wore them when they visited prostitutes so they didn't get the clap, but they didn't really want to present that kind of grotesque inner tube to their spouses in the more intimate environments of the marital home, which meant that everybody from the Archbishop of Canterbury to the Queen had large families. But how should Victorian mothers feed their huge clans? Not to mention their guests. Domestic goddess Catherine came up with the answer. Before anyone had heard of Mrs. Beeton, Mrs. Dickens wrote a successful book on entertaining in the home, the very sensibly titled What Shall We Have for Dinner? Written under the theatrical pseudonym of Lady Maria Clutterbuck, it's still in print today.
She produced this incredible series of menus, which are very inventive. Some of them are just for a mere 6 or 8 people, but these menus for 20 people, 5 courses, very kind of incident-packed, lots of, character and colour. In a way, they're the kind of her version of her husband's novels, really.
We're going to make something that's straight from that book, which is what?
Well, it's a leg of mutton stuffed with oysters and some herbs.
And interesting in the recipe, it says with the oysters to take off the beard and horny parts, because of course this is Victorian England and there's no horny parts allowed at all.
There's no horny parts. These are lovely, cleaned oysters.
Wholesome oysters.
Wholesome oysters.
So, what should I do to start?
If you wanted to chop some chervil, some marjoram and Awesome.
This was one of Charles's favourites, and according to Lady Clutterbuck, good food is a surefire way to a husband's heart. My attention to the requirements of his appetite, she wrote, secured me the possession of his esteem until the last.
And then these amazing oysters, which I know it's fantastic, isn't it? And, you know, the way that Catherine uses them in her recipes, we'd find probably quite extravagant. She's got recipes for oyster curry and, you know, oyster sauce.
Oh, I'm tempted to just throw half of them down my throat. For me, this dish is a perfect metaphor for Victorian life. The aphrodisiac, the sexy, kind of sheathed in the wholesome. So I think it's perfect.
I think Dickens knew about their reputation. When Catherine was pregnant, he said, well, I better stop eating oysters. So, there's this lovely, beautifully jointed mutton.
If I spoon there, do you want to invade the cavity in the politest way possible?
And then we can have some down here as well. So this is the fun bit. We need to tie it up. So it
I'm going to think of it as a sort of Christmas parcel. I don't know.
Yes, do a little bow on the top or something.
Yes.
Ladies were warned at the time that gentlemen had clubs to go to if they didn't give them a proper hot meal when they came home.
Right.
And actually, that's, you know that expression, the cold shoulder?
I do.
That's where that comes from. So if you give your husband a cold shoulder of mutton, you won't see him.
Simply because you provided a cold cut,
Because
that
you
would be
provided
it.
a cold cut.
Well, we've done some great Japanese rope bondage that should keep any husband happily there, I think. Right, let's give it a go, shall we? Delicious. Well done, Mrs. Dickens.
Oh, well done, Mrs. Dickens. She doesn't know what she's talking about.
That is good. I sort of feel the gout forming in my big toe as I'm eating it. Every Christmas, the family ate Twelfth Night cake, which doubled as Charlie's birthday cake. The more children his parents had, the bigger it got.
And actually, this is a very old trick. This is a Tudor trick. If you get the bean in the cake, you're the king for the evening, and a pea, which would make you the queen for the evening, and the king and the queen decide who does what for the celebrations.
OK.
And then, if you're a little less lucky, you might get the clove, the knave, the naughty boy.
What does it mean if you've got this windsock in your in your cake?
This rag means you're the slut.
Surely not in Victorian England. So you'd have your slut, your king, your queen, your servant. That's a party. Right, OK.
Get creaming.
Yep. I mean, you'd have forearms like Vin Diesel doing this, wouldn't you?
I think
the scullery maid would have been a real beefcake, wouldn't she?
I think cooks became real beefcakes, actually. I think they became quite tough ladies, really. They're exhausting.
Yeah. There are 14 pounds weight of ingredients in this one. Probably big enough even for the Dickens tribe at its peak. That's for the king.
The king.
There's the queen.
The queen.
So that's the knave going in. And finally, the old slag rag.
Slag rag.
So I'm just going to embed that like that?
I think so. We just mix it all up a bit and...
Happy days.
Put it in the tin.
It looks so angelic. Who'd have thought? Little slut inside.
And that goes in the oven for about 4 hours. So how is it? Is it delicious?
Oh, it really is good.
Oh, that is Christmas.
It really is great.
Christmas.
Look at that.
Yeah, so 1/12 cake.
That's an incredible thing.
Massive. 12th night cake. It sort of morphed into Christmas cake. And that's because Dickens, I wouldn't say single-handedly created that Christmas meal that we know about, but everything that was, all the food that was in A Christmas Carol, so roast turkey and plum pudding, that's all became the sort of standard idea of Christmas food, whereas before then, goose would have been much more common for poor people, for example.
So he's the bane of every poor woman's life as she contemplates putting the turkey on at, 9 o'clock in the morning. Just finish that bit off there. This is incredible. This is Mr. and Mrs. Dickens, and you can buy it, and there they are, happy and in love.
Happily married on their 12th cake.
Right, shall we see who gets to be slag? As Catherine's husband grew ever more famous, the Dickens family Christmas became an integral part of his brand.
Dickens was a wonderful Father Christmas, father figure for the nation, because of the Christmas Carol above all. And then after the Carol, he went on writing every Christmas. As some rather fed-up reviewer said, the appearance of Mr. Dickens on the publishing stage every Christmas is as predictable and inevitable as the appearance of Mr. Grimaldi the clown in the pantomime.
So there's always repeats at Christmas?
Yes, yes. I mean, Dickens was like the pantomime. You know, he came back at Christmas. He always wrote a Christmas story, Christmas book or Christmas story, until within a couple of years of the end of his life, and then he kind of got fed up.
For many years, the Dickens family Christmases were just as cheery as anything in his fiction, with his first love, theatre, right at the heart of it. For most people, exerting yourself at Christmas means rolling off the sofa headlong into an aluminium tin of chocolate. But for Dickens, it was an entirely different affair. By the early 1850s, he was corralling his entire family into appearing in these vast theatrical productions. Himself, surprise, surprise, centre stage. Of course, it's Dickens. He was the ultimate ham. He did everything from lights, lyrics, stage management. He even handed out the tickets.
They would have these stellar family theatricals, and Dickens would work on these for months. It was wonderful. They had carpenters appear in the house and turn the children's schoolroom into what Dickens called the smallest theatre in the world.
So no expense spared for this
no
production.
expense. He even hired a policeman to stand outside and check people's invitations to prevent gate crashing. But how wonderful, that kind of family time. Here people sit around the television. Imagine the whole family for weeks on end
We'd kill each other.
are building towards this. I was thinking more of the camaraderie and the joy, but you're probably
We'd kill
right.
each other. I'm exhausted just hearing about it. But the sad thing was, as the years went by, there was an increasing mismatch between the Christmas of Charles's fiction and the reality at home with Catherine. 16 relentless years of childbearing, no doubt topped off by all that good food, had changed her from this to this. In her matronly mid-30s, the bloom of her youth was a thing of the past. It's hard to say just how much weight she'd gained, but she was certainly heavy. Charles made barbed jokes about it to his friends. He reported that the carriage transporting her around town staggered under the weight of her, and that she nearly killed herself after gorging on a meal in Paris. If it was me, I'd call him a repressed Rasputin lookalike with an over-fondness for adverbs. Hey, this was the 19th century, and Catherine did what she was supposed to do. She put up, and she demurely shut up. Bleak House, please. Poor Catherine. And poor Charles. It wasn't just celebrity first wife syndrome. It was far more deep-seated than that.
The core diagnosis you would probably make of him would be that he has an attachment disorder. That is, that he feels very insecure in the moment he starts to depend on anyone. I did strongly smell neglect here, that his mother didn't tune into him when he was a baby, didn't meet his needs, didn't respond to him, wasn't connected. So he's somebody who feels a bit needy and unloved.
I mean, there's a lot of repressed anger there. What's the prognosis for someone who just can't let it go?
He can't deal with the idea of a three-dimensional woman, certainly not of a strong, independent, mature one, sexually mature or emotionally. So I think any woman that is with him as she ages will increasingly come to be confused with his mother.
Somewhere in that brilliant and complicated mind of his, Charles was still a child. A child who blamed his mother for that early trauma, slaving away in the blacking factory. As he himself wrote, he couldn't and wouldn't ever forgive her for sending him there. Woe betide anyone who reminded him of his mother. And in his novels, middle-aged women are usually ridiculous and never romantic. Like Mrs. Gamp, the boozy, eccentric midwife in Martin Chuzzlewit of 1844. The ultimate frump. So Catherine is sharing her home with a man who only really understands two types of women, the virgin or the frump. And everything in between those two polar opposites is pretty much a mystery to him. In that regard, he's like most Victorian men, who can only really hope to understand the wonders of the feminine psyche by applying rather blunt archetypes. But the problem is because he only understands that and that, there's a woeful lack of real women in his books, and there's potential nightmares lurking in his marriage. By giving Charles the family life he craved, Catherine was always doomed in his eyes to turn from angel to frump. His disenchantment intensified in 1854, when an old flame from before the marriage got in touch. Maria Winter. Charles, who'd so loved Catherine, then Mary, now convinced himself that in fact he'd loved Maria all the time.
I think she'd just written sort of saying, remember me, you know, and all that. And then she gets these passionate letters back from one of the most famous men in England, married with umpteen children, saying, I never loved anybody as I loved you. And, you know, see what I've carried in my heart through all these years and all these changes and so on. She gets a bit nervous and she keeps writing and saying, well, you know, I'm toothless, fat and 40 and so forth. He says, no, I don't believe it, you know, you're exactly as I remembered you. And then he meets her.
Maria was just as she'd described.
All these passionate letters to my dearest Maria, and then the minute after he's met her, the next letter is my dear Mrs. Winter, you know. Somehow that image of this pure love that he had once for Maria, having cherished it in his heart all this time, it somehow made the marriage tolerable, more than tolerable, made it work. But when that is smashed, within a couple of years, he's writing to Forster saying, you know, why is it with me like poor David Copperfield? You know, I always feel this old unhappy loss or want of something, the one friend and companion I've never made. That the marriage is doomed, really.
With the fat, middle-aged gossip Flora Finching in Little Dorrit started the following year, Dickens lampooned Maria, and perhaps Catherine herself. The final death blow to the marriage was delivered by a romantic melodrama that started out as just another Dickens family Christmas theatrical production. The Frozen Deep. Starring Dickens, it won glowing reviews. In 1857, it went on tour. Family amateurs were replaced by professionals. One was Ellen Ternan, a slim 18-year-old actress. Everything Catherine was not. She wasn't a great actress, but as Mrs. Crayford, she had a prophetic encounter with Dickens, the Arctic explorer, Wardour.
Who is it you want to find? Your wife? Who then? What is she like?
Young, with a fair, sad face, with kind, tender eyes, with a soft, clear voice, young and loving and merciful. I must wander, restless, sleepless, homeless, over the ice and over the snow, tossing on the sea, tramping the land, awake all night, awake all day, wander till I find her. You have no idea, he wrote about Ellen, how intensely I love her. From the racy theatrical world he so adored, Ellen was small and pretty. He called her Nellie, and he pursued her with all the vigour of Mr. Quilp.
Be my wife, my little cherry-cheeked, red-lipped wife. Say that Mrs. Quilp was 5 years or only 4. You were just the proper age for me.
The marriage was now in deep crisis. That October, Dickens ordered some little changes to be made at Tavistock House, namely the conversion of his dressing room into his bedroom, thereby effectively sealing him off from Catherine. It was DIVORCE, DIY. He no longer wanted to play the part of her husband, and she was no longer required to play the part of his wife.
Everyone in the house knew, all the servants, all the children, everybody knew. It's an extraordinary thing to have done. I mean, she was profoundly wounded, obviously, and she was bewildered, I think.
What must she have thought when a week or so later, Dickens's The Lazy Tour of the Two Idle Apprentices was published? It features a disenchanted husband trying to hypnotise his wife into an early grave. He felt nothing but contempt for her. She'd long been in the way, and he had long been weary. He sat before her day after day, night after night, looking the word at her when he did not utter it. As often as her large, unmeaning eyes were raised from her hands in which she rocked her head towards the stern figure, sitting with crossed arms and knitted forehead in the chair, they read in it, "Die." When she fell upon her old entreaty to be pardoned, she was answered, "Die!" When she'd outwatched and outsuffered the long night and the rising sun flamed into the sombre room, she heard it hailed with, "Another day and not dead. Die." It's hard to look at Catherine and not feel sadness, because ultimately she did exactly what it said on the tin. She was an ideal wife and mother. She looked after hearth and home, was the ultimate domestic manager. Perhaps it was Catherine more than Charles that created all those elements that were formalised in the pages of A Christmas Carol. For Christmas 1857, Tavistock House just wasn't the same. There was no party, no family play, and no 12th night cake. It was Catherine's last Christmas with the family. Salacious rumours about Dickens and his other woman swept literary London. To prove it wasn't her, Catherine's sister Georgina had a virginity test. The knives were out, and for Charles, there was only one villain in the piece.
You see this in marriages all the time. Charles projects onto his wife a lot of the problems that he has. He uses her as a garbage truck, basically, for all the bad things in him. And the consequence is that he can't, once you've created somebody who is this ogre, you can't live with an ogre anymore.
Charles went for the kill, making Catherine look bad and mad to make himself look good. Dickens intimated that the children loathed their mother, and she in turn wasn't too fond of them either. And any appearance of them having affection for her was merely that, an appearance or performance. He wrote to a family friend, "The little play that is acted in the drawing room is not the truth, and the less the children play it, the better for themselves." The Tavistock family drama was truly unravelling. "My father was like a madman," wrote the Dickens' eldest daughter, Kate. "He did not care a damn what happened to any of us. Nothing could surpass the misery and unhappiness of our home." Charles wrote a statement later leaked to the American press. In it, he made the outrageous claim that Catherine had a mental disorder and that she wanted to leave the family. He addressed his British public with protestations of innocence.
Now, everybody knows that the best way to deflect attention from a scandal, to draw fire away, is to print a major denial in a national newspaper. Bigger, the better. Louder and more furious. That way, everyone will absolutely know you've done nothing wrong, nothing to be ashamed of. And Dickens did exactly this. This is the Times of London, which my manservant has woefully forgotten to iron, and it's June the 7th, 1858. And this is the retraction that gentlemen across London would be waking up to read. I most solemnly declare, and this I do both in my own name and my wife's name, that all the lately whispered rumours touching the trouble at which I have glanced are abominably false. You can hear the righteous indignation. And that whoever repeats one of them after this denial will lie as wilfully and foully as is possible for any false witness to lie, before heaven and earth. Charles Dickens. I think that's the very dictionary definition of protesting too much. On the very day Charles publicly denied any anger or ill will towards Catherine, behind the scenes, his lawyers were drawing up a telling document. It's now kept at Doughty Street, once the couple's happy home. This is the deed of separation, which is, you know, impenetrable, almost full of legalese and deeply intimidating. Decades of marriage ends, not with a bang or a whimper, but this sort of austere legal document. It says here, the said Catherine Dickens shall not and will not at any time or times hereafter molest or disturb the said Charles Dickens, nor shall commence or prosecute any suit or suits in any court or courts for compelling or obliging him, the said Charles Dickens, to cohabit or live with her. She signs that, and she signs the end of her marriage.
Under Victorian law, he couldn't divorce her because she hadn't committed adultery. So Charles pushed through the separation, paying Catherine the substantial sum of £600 a year to get her out of his life.
She's not free to remarry. She has no role. She has no role as wife, she has no role as mother. What role is she to have as an uneducated woman who has spent the entirety of her life supporting her husband? It's extraordinarily powerful. You know, and she's been somebody pivotal in the role of wife for decades, and now sidelined. It folds up to something almost negligible, but it's, you know, in the effect it has, it must have just been like a whirlwind wrecking her life. It's a pretty poor show from our national treasure, isn't it?
Forced out of the family home by Charles, Catherine began her new life here in Camden, North London. Under Victorian law, the children stayed with their father. Only Charlie, now an adult, could opt to stay with her. The Dickens' two daughters took piano and singing lessons opposite, but enthralled their father. They never visited Catherine. I have now, God help me, only one course to pursue, Catherine wrote to a friend. One day I may be able to tell you how hardly I have been used.
In the Victorian age, men had all the power. Wives had absolutely no rights at all. So when he kept the children, when he separated from Catherine, that was just what would have happened at the time. There would have been no suggestion to anybody that she would have kept the children. The suggestion was that she should have stayed in the home and not been forced out in the first place.
Some of his closest friends openly ran a mistress as well as a wife. But as the nation's Father Christmas and family icon, Dickens could do no such thing. Even now, he couldn't be seen with a mistress. In 1858, he forced Ellen off the stage and out of the public eye.
Just as he ended her theatrical career, Dickens started a new one, propelling himself into the spotlight as never before. He began touring the nation, performing extracts from his novels in dazzling one-man shows. He did so, he wrote, to wear and tear my storm away. Now he was back with a family he hadn't cut in two. His audience, the great British public.
He felt terrible. He knew he'd done something wrong. He's a guilty man who's haunted by his wrongdoing, and he tries to make amends 6 times a week with matinees.
Crisscrossing the country also gave him perfect cover for seeing Ellen Ternan. Dickens was so odd, some biographers believe they never consummated their relationship, although 2 of his children said Ellen had a baby by him. If so, it seems it died young. Whatever the truth, he now led a crazy itinerant life with multiple addresses and several identities. One was Charles Tringham, named after his local tobacconist.
I find it ridiculous that basically a man who was so accomplished at creating great names for his characters couldn't think of a decent one for his own nom de plume. I mean, that's pathetic. It shows a total lack of imagination. I mean, it's like me calling myself Sue Costcutter.
His late novels are imaginative triumphs that reflect his torment. In Great Expectations of 1861, it's the torture of unrequited sexual longing. In The Mystery of Edwin Drood of 1870, it's a murderous, guilty secret that no one must discover. These were also dark years for the woman he'd driven out of their home.
Catherine referred to the 1860s as her period of widowhood, and also claimed that if she saw Dickens, it would kill her. And in fact, she did see him. She saw him at the theatre. She was so distressed that she was taken home in floods of tears.
In her self-styled widowhood, Catherine couldn't share Christmas with most of her children. She used to hold parties for local youngsters, as if trying to recreate the family she'd lost. The rest of the family spent their Christmases here at the new home in Kent, run by Catherine's sister, Georgina. A dozen years manic writing and performing aged Dickens fast. By 1870, only 58, he was a sick man. That March, his last ever public readings included one of his audience's favourites, Sikes and Nancy, the prostitute's brutal murder by her lover. Over 30 years before, Catherine had been the first person ever to hear him read it. She'd wept and wept.
The girl was lying, half-dressed, upon the bed. "Get up!" The girl rose to withdraw the curtain. "Let it be. There's light enough for what I've got to do." "Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. Think of all I've given up for you, Bill. Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood." The housebreaker freed one arm, grasped his pistol and beat it twice upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell. Raising herself to her knees, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. The murderer, staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the light with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down.
9th of June 1870, Dickens died, with Ellen Ternan at his side. Catherine was kept away. A friend wrote, her sorrow was overwhelming. Dickens was buried at Westminster Abbey, mourned by the public he'd courted all his life. It was said one devastated little girl asked, "Will Father Christmas die too?" His daughter, Kate, was relieved he was dead, as she was convinced he was going insane. Published soon after his death, an early biography contains an astonishing appendix. His will. The first thing that strikes me is the first bequest. I give the sum of £1,000 to Miss Ellen Lawless Ternan. And then, after all the various provisions for his children, we get this. And I desire here simply to record the fact my wife, since our separation, by consent, has been in receipt of me of an annual income of £600, while all the great charges of a numerous and expensive family have devolved wholly upon myself. Even on his deathbed, he's saying, I did everything I could. Honestly, it wasn't my fault. I gave her loads of money. She's had a massive income, and I had to look after all the kids. Oh, poor you, Charles. The great shame is, you know, even at the end, even as he calls her his wife, he humiliates her one last and final time. After Charles's death, Catherine got her family Christmas back. But most of her children had now flown the nest. Many of her sons were far overseas, sent to the colonies by their father. Young Skull had already died there. How the ghosts of Christmas past must have haunted her, especially on Twelfth Night. Oh, what a wonderful pudding! Happy, happy Christmas! As for the other woman, Ellen finally had her family Christmases too. She married a vicar and, as Mrs. Robinson, had 2 children. Catherine never remarried. Charles had burnt her letters to him, but on her deathbed in 1879, she left the British Museum his letters to her. That the world may know, she said, he once loved me. She inhabited 2 completely different Christmases. Firstly, the Technicolor morality play of The Christmas Carol with its plum puddings and goodwill amongst men and turkey dinners. But she also experienced a much more modern Christmas, one that's certainly familiar to me, full of family bitterness and recrimination, of cold shoulders, silence and awkwardness. But the sad and bitter irony for her was that it could be said that both of those experiences were authored by her husband, Charles Dickens. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, all of us. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.